Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It is my distinct pleasure to be amongst you and to be able to introduce a very distinguished panel of speakers. We have three very well-known, internationally recognized scholars among us. We have Professor David Perlmutter, we have Professor Hilary Kremin, and Professor Tom Gage among us this afternoon. They are going to share their thoughts on principles and methodologies in peace education. First of all, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. David Perlmutter. Professor David Perlmutter is the director of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and also a Starch faculty fellow and international programs faculty fellow at the University of Iowa. He is the author or editor of 9 books on political communication and persuasion, including Photojournalism and Foreign Policy, Framing Icons of Outrage in International Crises, Visions of War, Picturing Warfare from the Stone Age to the Cyberoge, Blogwars, The New Political Battleground. These are just some of his books that have already been published. He has also written extensively and published over a dozen research articles for academic journal, as well as more than 200 essays for US and international newspapers and magazines. Professor Perlmutter has been interviewed by most major news networks and newspapers, including the New York Times, CNN, ABC, and The Daily Show. It is my pleasure to present before you Professor David Perlmutter.
I want to thank the Fountain and the Peace Islands Institute for coming here today, and of course the inspirer of both, Dr. Fethullah Gulen. My father, who I just learned the distinguished moderator knew and has quoted, was a professor of international business. He died last year, and when I went to go clean up his apartment, I found that on his bedstand, the last book that he was reading was Dr. Gulen's book on Towards a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance. And actually, my father had called me the day before, about the day before he died, and had said, "I'm just reading a new book by a very interesting author. I'm learning a lot here. I can't wait to talk to you about it." We never got a chance to talk about it, and I've made a pledge since then that I'm going to try to read all 60 of Dr. Gulen's books, but the problem is he keeps writing new ones, so if anybody knows him here, please tell him to slow down a little bit so I can catch up there, but I look forward to it. It's a really inspiring book to those of you who haven't seen it. I deal with images and politics, and the origins of thinking about the ways that pictures have effects on people, and my inspiration for that was that long ago I was in a classroom, and I remember a professor showing a picture from the Vietnam War, and saying this image had a powerful effect on the nation, on the United States. And I was, at the same time, taking a social science research methodology course, and the teacher in that course said, anytime anybody says something has a powerful effect, you have the right to ask, how do we know that? Has actually somebody studied it? And it turned out that very few people actually study this. And there's a lot of stories and tall tales and just assumptions. There's a lot of research that's being done, and that research is coming from my field of mass communication. It's coming from psychology, anthropology, sociology, history. Now more and more research is coming from studies of the brain, where they're actually wiring people or looking at the way through CAT scans and other imaging technology, how people react to all sorts of stimuli. But most of what people know or think they know about the powerful effects of pictures, or what those powerful effects mean, if there are any, they get from stories that are passed on. I call it the incredible disappearing footnote. You will read in a book published in 2011, this picture had a powerful effect on the US public during the Vietnam War, and there'll be a footnote, and I'll look up that footnote, and it'll be a quote from another book saying, this picture had a powerful effect. And then I'll look up the footnote for that one, and you'll go back in time, 30, 40 years, and then you'll find one person in a newspaper article said, boy, that picture really affected me. So I've tried with my students and with others to sort of urge, before we make the extraordinary claims, we should try to look at the evidence. Now, in this case, we have some original evidence, and I wrote a book a couple of years ago about the history of the visualization of warfare, and I decided to go back to humankind's first medium. Before there was a television, and believe it or not, for the younger people in the room, before there was the iPad and the iPhone, there was the cave wall. And the very first medium that people used to contain communication acts were the famous cave paintings, that, at least that we find from what is now the region called the Franco-Cantabria, which is basically where Spain and France meet. And for those of you who've seen in books, I'm sure, or maybe the very lucky few who've seen some of the originals or the very good copies of the originals in the caves that the French and Spanish government put up, they're really spectacular. And we have no artist notebooks. We don't know why they made this. You know, it's a wonderful field to speculate because the artist can't show up and tell you you're wrong. You know, so, well, one of the interesting questions that always comes up with this art was this a reflection of the world around them? Were they trying to do some sort of documentary of the different kinds of animals that lived in their world? And you find that that's not true, that when the scientists who study the cave peoples of that time do what's called an archaeofaunal survey and look at, for example, what animals actually existed in the area at the time that the paintings were put up, you see a wild discordance. The discordance sounds a lot like complaints today about my area of journalism, mass communications, where the news often shows the worst or the exceptional rather than the common. I was saying to the Honorable Minister from Tanzania how your country has had 50 years of peace, love, and understanding, and that's why we've never heard of you. You know, and you're not a news story. I guess if you're not in the news, it's probably a good sign. So congratulations on not being covered there. We hope actually there should be more. Well, my argument is that actually you can see some patterns in these pictures. For example, the animals that are wildly overrepresented are the large game animals, the large, fatty, juicy, delicious game animals that were extremely hard to hunt and kill, and also provided a glorious caloric pay package to whoever killed them. And so my argument is that the other stuff that they were eating, there's very few pictures of salmon. There's no pictures of nuts and berries. So in other words, the kind of stuff that they were actually getting most of their calories from just wasn't considered important enough. Well, you can probably imagine what was happening. Org, the cave hunter, killed one mammoth, and he never stopped talking about it ever since then. And when he ran for office as governor of the tribe, he said, "Vote for Org, and I'll put a mammoth in every cave." And so they wildly overrepresented what was really important to them. So in other words, if anybody ever tells you about how the news or a government misrepresents something or overrepresents something or engages in propaganda, it's a natural human function. We take pictures and we show the world that we want it to be, the world the way that we think it should be, rather than often the way in a statistical survey of what it actually is. Well, the era of warfare in the Neolithic, when people started getting organized in larger tribes, and we see the very first pictures of warfare, is fascinating. And we also learn something from that, because almost immediately you see the differentiations among groups. In fact, I have a little test where I found that you can show school children who have absolutely no knowledge of the culture, the history of any particular period, up till about the age of photography, and you show them a picture of war, especially a painting or such of a battle, and you ask them a very simple question: who's the big man? This is a term from anthropology. Who's the guy in charge? Well, remember, until very recently, the guy in charge, the general, was probably the person who commissioned the art. And so those school children can look at a Mayan tapestry, can look at North African rock paintings, Australian rock paintings, and say, oh, I know who the commander was. And they are physically differentiated. They're larger. They also have larger penises in the descriptions that are shown on the cave walls. Everything possible to make them look better than everyone else. Well, we do have almost immediately the question of what happened when there was catastrophic warfare where there were large amounts of people killed, and what pictures did people show at that time? We don't have early evidence of pictures for peace. We have avoidance of pictures of different kinds of warfare. And this is one example. This is a bone bed. This is a bone bed that could be from the odd 10,000 genocides and massacres that our species has committed over the many millennia that we've been killing each other in war. But this one happens to come from about 1300 AD in what is a site now known as Crow Creek, South Dakota. And there was apparently a period of great environmental stress, a lot of fighting between the tribes in the area, and basically one tribe massacred another tribe and killed almost everyone in it and did it pretty horrifically. And this is the bone bed that was found of most of the people of that tribe who were thrown into a pit, something, again, very reminiscent of modern warfare. And of course, we find some of the evidence that probably tries to show why it happened. That there was a shortage of food in the area. They were fighting over reduced resources, something that modern political scientists and international relations people can talk about. Some of the causes of war among groups today. But what imagery was shown? We don't have, as if there was a New York Times at the time. We don't have something that was exactly one-to-one match. But if you look at the images of warfare that were carved on the rocks, on the outdoor art of the time, you see none of this kind of massive warfare. You only see what would be called, I think, justly, Homeric warfare. That is, that you see individual people engaged in one-to-one battles, not even large groups. Well, so again, from very early era, before even the rise of large states in a particular area and the sort of so-called propaganda machinery that we're used to thinking about propaganda, they were making selective choices, that the kind of warfare where men and women and children were killed, the kind of warfare that existed on larger scales just wasn't interesting to them or wasn't what they wanted to show of themselves. They, as the warriors thought of themselves as heroic individuals fighting with other heroic individuals. So again, those choices are made over and over by societies. The question is, what did they mean? The picture that we mostly think of as a picture of peace as a protest against war is the picture of the atrocity, where we see men and women killed, children killed, something horrible happening, and we see something as a notation of this is war, or look at this terrible thing that happened to these people. The political perspective that I bring to this is that that's a recent incarnation in human history, that up till really about the 16th century, most times when you see what we would today call the horrors of war or the atrocities of war, they were not meant to be statements of this is so bad, but this is meant to be we're bad, as in like you mess with us and this is going to happen to you. The best example of this is the ancient Assyrian Empire, which made almost a monopoly business of this, where they would destroy an enemy city and then they would put up pictures in the palaces of the Assyrian kings. Now, these pictures were purposive. That is, ambassadors from other nations that the Assyrians were either fighting or planning to fight or negotiating with would come walking along, and they would see stela after stela and relief after relief of this is what happens if you mess with us. So you better surrender to the Assyrians right now, or your city is going to face this. There doesn't seem to be any notation within their iconography and their ideology that like, oh, this is terrible and it's unfortunate that it's happened. Now, that inclination, I'm sorry, some of these pictures are pretty bad, but of course we're talking about pictures of war and peace here. I apologize if anybody's disturbed, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. Around the 16th century, for the very first time, and it really has to do with the 30 Years' War in Europe and some of the devastating wars there, where people were engaging in mass and wholesale slaughters, at the same time as a new technology of printing, especially etching and engraving, came along, where you didn't necessarily have to have the whole power of a state or be commissioned by a king to be able to produce something. In other words, printing, as we all have heard about Gutenberg and such, was an ability to democratize communication about war and about peace. And it's very interesting, the moment that ordinary people have access to spreading information, visual information about war, is when you first see images which are shown of atrocities and disasters, which are specifically meant to say this is an atrocity and this is a disaster and we should stop it from happening. So once upon a time, we used to show these kind of pictures as in civilizations and say this is not terrible, this is who we are, the Assyrians and so on. Now we are saying that it is a bad thing for this to happen. Now, almost always, as it is today, these kind of images were shown as saying, our enemy, our evil enemy, is doing things like this. The same people who produce this kind of lithography would not say, and also we're doing it too. So that distinction had not been made yet. They were still propaganda pictures to make somebody else look bad. One of the other lessons that you learn about this, and again, I promise at the end of this presentation I'm going to talk about some very hopeful things, so I apologize for this trip down the really bad part of memory lane of human history. But one of the other assumptions that I think is just patently false is that if you show an image of the atrocity of war, of horrors of war, that everyone will think of it in the same way. But we have 100 years of research in social psychology to show that it's not that seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. That people look at images through the lens of their own cultural, historical experience, and the same two people can look at the same picture and come to a very different conclusion of it. And I think one of the best examples of this is the very few sets of actual images that we have from the perpetration of the European Holocaust of European Jews, but also of other groups. Almost all of them were created by the people who did it. And I invite any of you who would like to study this further. There's a wonderful archive in Germany, in Koblenz, the Bundesarchive, where they have a lot of the original photography of the German army. And these German war photographers would travel with the army, and they would take souvenir snapshots of the slaughter. But it was pretty clear that they had no intention or thought of this as slaughter. They were just taking pictures as if, they were tourists who were coming along. Oh, there's an interesting church. I'll take a picture of the church, and now I'll take a picture of burning down the church, and then I'll take a picture of killing everybody in the church. So there doesn't seem to be any notation that this was something that disturbed them while they were doing it. So one man's atrocity photo is another person's souvenir snapshot. And one last example I want to give you is the one that actually started me on this quest of trying to understand what are the effects of images. This is from 1968, and I put here a question mark because there's a couple questions about this image that haven't been resolved. But General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, who was in the South Vietnamese military police, executed somebody who was described and later confirmed to be a Viet Cong officer on the streets of Saigon in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. This is probably one of the most famous pictures ever taken in photojournalism, and almost always when you see this picture appear, you'll see some caption or some notation about this was the picture that changed America's mind about the war. And again, if you're going to make that kind of a statement, it seems to me that somebody else has the right to say, okay, well, that's interesting. What evidence do we have of that? These are some of the statements, and I have, in one of my books, I have about 100 statements about this picture of this different kind. It shocked the world. Turning point of the war, worldwide fear was created. Nothing did as much damage to the war effort as this picture. Well, so one of my studies was to go back and actually see what evidence. And again, I'm not saying the picture had no effect, but some of the areas where you'd think there would have been some effect if it really was that powerful, they weren't there. For example, sorry. Okay, so let me just take a couple for example here. Again, social psychology tells us that people have sympathy with people that they have sympathy with. That's not a startling finding. So in 1968, there was a lot of surveying done during the Vietnam War, and overwhelmingly it found that although by then I think about 40 to 45% of Americans had decided that they were against the war, very few of them did so because they had sympathy with the Viet Cong. In fact, what they did was they had problems with all other issues with the war. So it's actually unlikely that the large majority of the American public would feel bad that a Viet Cong suspect was killed, especially when the Viet Cong were killing American soldiers. So, yeah, I'm going to finish right now. Thank you. Yeah, 3 minutes. And so what we found was that there was no human interest link there, and the surveying that's been found over the years of wartime concerns shows that overwhelmingly during wartime, Americans are concerned about the casualty, not just mortality, but casualty rates of American soldiers. In fact, you can look at the surveys and show as casualty rates go up, support for a war goes down. However, and this is the good part here, the picture did have an effect on leaders. And that's where you can have pictures for peace or pictures of anti-war can make an effect. And what it's called is the first-person effect, is that and a leader may say, in this case it was President Johnson, may say, wow, that picture is pretty powerful. It's going to have a lot of effects on other people. Or you can have a leader say, I'm really worried about the effects on other people. And the best example of that was during the Gulf War, where we actually have Colin Powell saying that he was very worried about the pictures coming out of Iraq, and so he called President Bush, the first Bush, and said, let's stop the war. So it's a one-to-one effect of a picture, but only on one person, not necessarily on the public. So the overall and final suggestion I have is that whatever you're trying to do with pictures of peace, actually the research evidence supports exactly what the previous speakers were talking about, is you have to work on changing the minds of the people who are receiving the pictures and making them think about the enemy or who we're fighting or who we don't necessarily want to fight as human beings and not just something that's the fodder of pictures. Thank you very much.